The lawyer read the second sentence of my father's will out loud, and the room went so quiet I could hear the ice machine humming in the kitchen down the hall. I leave full and sole ownership of Bennett Millwork to my son, Derek Bennett. As he alone has stood by me in my final years, I looked across the table at my older brother, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at his own hands, folded neatly on the table, like a man who already knew exactly what that sentence was going to say before the lawyer ever opened his mouth. My father had promised me, my whole adult life, that Bennett Millwork would be split 3 ways between me, Derek, and our younger brother Sam, with a trust set up to make sure Sam, who has cerebral palsy and needs lifetime care, would never have to depend on anyone's goodwill to survive. I had heard my father say those words at our kitchen table more times than I could count. And now a lawyer I'd never met was reading a document dated 6 weeks before my father's death that said none of that had ever been true. I sat there in that conference room feeling the floor tilt under me because I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof yet, that my father had not written those words willingly. And 3 days later, going through his old roll-top desk to find nothing more than a spare house key, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, tucked behind a false panel he'd built into that desk himself 30 years earlier. That envelope was about to destroy every single lie my brother had told our family in the 6 months since our father died. If you're new to The Quiet Rise, welcome. We tell true stories about the moments truth finally catches up to the lies built to bury it. If a story like that means something to you, stick around and subscribe because we've got a new one every week. My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 38. I work as a certified public accountant here in a small town in western Pennsylvania. And my father, Walter Bennett, spent 41 years building a millwork company from a single table saw in our garage into a business that employed 23 people and supplied custom cabinetry to half the contractors in 3 counties. He built that company for us, all 3 of his kids, and he never once let me forget it. He used to say Bennett Millwork wasn't his legacy, it was ours, and his job was just to hand it to us in good enough shape that we wouldn't have to start over the way he had. My mother passed when I was 26, a heart condition nobody caught in time, and after that my father leaned on the 3 of us differently, each in our own way. Derek, 4 years older than me, had worked at the company since he was 18, running operations, and everyone assumed he'd eventually take over the day-to-day leadership, which never bothered me because leadership was never what I wanted. I built my own accounting practice in town instead, close enough to help my father with the books whenever he needed it, close enough to visit twice a week. Sam, 6 years younger than me, lived in a group home 20 minutes from my father's house, independent in some ways, dependent in others, and my father visited him every single Sunday without fail for as long as I can remember. Sam has cerebral palsy, diagnosed at birth, and while his mind is sharp, sharper than most people give him credit for on first meeting him, his body requires a level of physical care that our family made peace with decades ago as simply part of who we were. My father used to say Sam taught him more about patience and love than anything else in his life, and he meant it. Never once in a way that sounded like a burden being described, always in a way that sounded like gratitude. The trust my father wanted to set up for Sam wasn't charity in his mind. It was simply making sure his youngest child never had to worry about the roof over his head or the care his body needed. The same security he wanted for all of us, just structured a little differently because Sam's needs were structured a little differently too. About 2 years before he died, my father started forgetting things. Small things at first, a bill paid twice, a customer's name he'd known for a decade, suddenly slipping away from him mid-sentence. Then bigger things. He got lost driving home from Sam's group home one Sunday evening, a route he'd driven weekly for 15 years, and a neighbor found him parked on the shoulder of a road 2 miles from his own house, disoriented, unable to say where he was trying to go. The diagnosis came about 8 months later. Early-stage vascular dementia, progressive, unpredictable in its pace. The kind of thing that leaves a person lucid and sharp some days, and completely lost on others. Derek was the one who stepped in to manage my father's care during that period, moving into the house with him, handling his medications, his appointments, his finances. I offered to help more directly, but Derek insisted he had it handled, and honestly at the time, I was grateful someone was willing to take on that much responsibility. I visited every week. I called every few days. But Derek controlled access to my father in a way I didn't fully register as strange until much later, always present during my visits, always steering conversations away from anything involving the business or the will, always finding a reason my visits needed to be shorter than I wanted them to be. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearer than I could at the time. The way grief and gratitude can make you slow to notice things that would otherwise raise every alarm bell you have. There was a stretch, maybe for months before my father died, when Derek started mentioning, almost casually, in the middle of unrelated conversations, that our father had been talking about updating some paperwork, never specifics, always vague, always dropped in and then moved past quickly, like a seed planted and left to grow on its own without anyone examining it too closely. I remember one Sunday dinner where my father seemed unusually quiet, unusually far away, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, Derek answered for him before he could, saying he'd just had a long day at the doctor's and needed rest. I didn't push. I wish more than almost anything else in this whole story that I had pushed. My father passed in his sleep on a Tuesday in early spring, the dementia having progressed faster in his final months than any of us expected. The funeral was small, close family, a handful of longtime employees who'd worked for him for decades and cried harder than some of the relatives did. I remember feeling, in the days after, a strange kind of peace, believing that whatever came next, the business, the estate, all of it, would unfold the way my father had always told us it would. I gave the eulogy that day, standing in front of maybe 60 people in a small chapel outside town, talking about the table saw in our garage and the 23 employees it eventually grew into, about Sunday visits to Sam that never once got skipped in over a decade, about a man who genuinely believed fairness wasn't just a nice idea, but something you built into the structure of your life. On purpose, the same way you'd build a load-bearing wall. I had no idea, standing at that podium, how soon those words about fairness would be tested in a way I never could have imagined. The will reading happened 2 weeks after the funeral, in the office of an attorney named Gregory Halstead, a name I didn't recognize, which struck me as odd even before I understood why. My father's longtime attorney, a man named Philip Ostrander who'd handled Bennett family legal matters for over 20 years, had retired the previous year, and apparently, according to Derek, my father had transitioned to Halstead sometime after that, a detail nobody had mentioned to me until I was sitting in Halstead's conference room, hearing him read a will that gave my brother sole ownership of everything. Halstead's office was nothing like Philip's had been. Philip's office, the one I remembered from childhood, smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, decorated with photographs of his grandkids and a fish he'd mounted after catching it on a trip to Canada decades earlier. Halstead's office was sleek and impersonal, glass and chrome, the kind of space that told you nothing about the person who worked there, which in hindsight felt like exactly the right kind of office for what turned out to have happened inside it. The will was dated 6 weeks before my father's death, a period when, based on everything I'd witnessed and everything his doctors had documented, his cognitive state was declining sharply, with days of confusion far outnumbering days of clarity. The will made no mention of a trust for Sam, no mention of any provision for me. Just Derek, full ownership, full control, a single paragraph explaining that Derek alone had stood by our father in his final years, language that felt less like something my father would say and more like something written to justify a decision that needed justifying. I asked Derek, right there in that conference room, in front of the lawyer, whether he'd known about this. He said our father had made the decision on his own, that he'd simply driven him to the appointment because our father could no longer drive himself, that he hadn't been in the room for the actual signing. I remember watching his face while he said it, and I remember not believing a single word. Our aunt, my father's younger sister, was sitting beside me during that reading. I remember her hand finding mine under the table the moment Halstead finished the paragraph about Derek's sole ownership, squeezing once, hard, a silent signal that she didn't believe it either. She'd known my father longer than any of us, had watched him build that company from nothing. And she leaned close afterward, out in the parking lot, and told me quietly that the man she'd grown up with would never have written a sentence blaming his other children for abandoning him, not in 1,000 years, no matter what his mind had or hadn't been doing in those final months. That conversation in the parking lot was the first moment I let myself fully believe what some part of me had already known sitting in that conference room. I didn't say anything else that day. I drove home in a kind of numb disbelief, replaying every visit I'd had with my father in his final months, searching for a moment, a hint, anything that would explain a decision this far outside everything he'd ever told me he wanted. I found nothing, because there was nothing to find. My father hadn't changed his mind. Something else had happened, and I didn't yet know what. 3 days later, I drove to my father's house to start the slow, painful process of sorting through his things, a task Derek hadn't shown much interest in helping with, already treating the house and everything in it like it belonged to him alone. I went looking for a spare house key I remembered him keeping in his old roll-top desk. A piece of furniture that had been in our family since before I was born, sitting in the same corner of his study my entire life. I pulled open the bottom drawer and found it stuck, catching on something. When I worked it free and reached inside, my hand found the edge of a thin wooden panel that didn't belong there. False back my father must have built into the drawer himself. It's a kind of quiet, careful craftsmanship that was exactly like him. Behind that panel was a single envelope, sealed with my name written across the front in his handwriting. A handwriting I recognized instantly, even though it looked shakier than I remembered. The kind of unsteady penmanship that comes in the later stages of an illness like his. I remember sitting back on my heels in that dusty study, sunlight coming through the window at the same slant it always had on late afternoons, and feeling a strange mix of dread and hope before I'd even broken the seal. Dread, because some instinct told me whatever was inside was going to confirm the worst of what I'd started to suspect since that conference room. Hope, because for the first time since the will reading, I felt like I might finally be about to hear my father's actual voice again, instead of Derek's version of what my father supposedly wanted. I sat down on the floor of that study and opened it right there. My hands not quite steady either. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, dated almost a year before his death, written back when his handwriting was still strong and clear, back before the worst of the decline had set in. And folded inside those pages was a second document, a will properly executed. Witnessed by 2 names I recognized as longtime employees of the millwork company and notarized by Philip Ostrander himself, dated 14 months before the will Halstead had read aloud in that conference room. This earlier will split ownership of Bennett Millwork 3 ways, equally between Derek, myself, and a trust established specifically for Sam's lifetime care, funded by a designated share of company profits. Structured as my father wrote in the accompanying letter, so that Sam would never have to depend on anyone's kindness to be taken care of the way he deserved. The letter itself broke something open in my chest that I'm still not sure has fully healed. My father wrote that he was putting this letter and this will somewhere only I would think to look, because he trusted me, more than anyone, to protect Sam if something ever happened to change his own ability to protect him. He wrote that he loved all 3 of his children equally, that Derek's hard work at the company deserved recognition and respect, but never at the expense of fairness to his siblings, and that if anything ever felt wrong after he was gone, he wanted me to trust that instinct completely, because he was already starting to notice changes in himself he didn't like, moments of confusion he was trying to hide from all of us. And he didn't know how much longer he could trust his own judgment going forward. Reading that letter, understanding that my father had seen his own decline coming and had tried, in whatever way he still could, to protect us from what might happen because of it, undid me completely. I sat on that study floor and cried in a way I hadn't even let myself cry at the funeral. But underneath the grief was something sharper, something that hardened into resolve almost immediately. Because if this earlier will was real, properly executed, exactly what my father wanted, then the will Halstead had read 2 weeks earlier wasn't just wrong, it was fraudulent, and someone had gotten my father. In a compromised state, to sign away everything he'd spent a lifetime trying to protect, I called Philip Ostrander the next morning. He remembered drafting that earlier will clearly, remembered my father sitting across from him fully lucid, talking through every provision in detail, especially the trust for Sam, which Philip told me my father had described, almost word for word, the same way he'd described it to me 100 times over the years. Philip told me he'd retired from active practice the following year, health reasons, nothing to do with my father, and had no idea Walter had apparently gone to a different attorney afterward. When I told him about the second will, dated 6 weeks before my father's death, giving everything to Derek, Philip went quiet for a long moment, and then told me, carefully, that given everything I was describing about my father's cognitive state during that period, I needed to speak to an elder law attorney immediately, because what I was describing had a name, undue influence. and courts took it seriously when there was evidence to support it. I hired an elder law attorney named Renata Cole, who specialized in exactly this kind of dispute, will contests built around questions of testamentary capacity and undue influence. She explained the legal standard carefully. To challenge the later will, we'd need to show that at the time it was signed, my father either lacked the mental capacity to understand what he was signing, or that Derek had exerted improper pressure that overrode my father's own free will, substituting Derek's wishes for my father's. Medical records documenting the progression of his dementia would matter enormously. So would witness testimony about his state of mind during that specific period. So would anything unusual about how the second will had actually been executed. Renata warned me early on that cases like this rarely move quickly, and that the emotional toll of contesting a sibling's inheritance publicly, in a small town where everyone would eventually hear some version of the story, was something I needed to prepare myself for honestly before committing to it. She'd seen families torn apart permanently by exactly this kind of fight. She told me, and she wanted to make sure I understood, that pursuing the truth, even when I was clearly right to pursue it, was going to cost something regardless of how the case turned out.
Yes.
I told her I understood, though I don't think I actually did, not fully, until I was living through the months that followed. That last detail turned out to matter more than any of us expected. Renata requested the full execution file from Halstead's office. Notarization records, the witness signatures, everything required to make a will legally valid. What came back contained an inconsistency that, once we saw it, felt almost too obvious to have gone unnoticed. The notary listed on the will was a woman named Deborah Prince. Renata cross-referenced the notary's registered commission dates with the state database and found that Deborah Prince's notary commission had actually expired for months before the date listed on my father's will. Either the notarization had happened somewhere else entirely and been backdated, or it hadn't happened the way the document claimed at all. Renata also discovered, through a subpoena of Halstead's scheduling records, that Deborah Prince wasn't an independent notary at all. She worked as an office assistant at a different business, one that, according to public filings, was co-owned by Derek's wife's brother, not a random notary pulled off the street to witness a signature. Someone connected, however loosely, to my brother's own family. I confronted Derek about all of this on a Sunday afternoon, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where our father used to promise us, over and over, that the business would always be split fairly. I laid out what Renata had found: the expired notary commission, the connection to his wife's brother, the earlier will, hidden in that desk. That directly contradicted everything he'd told the family about our father's final wishes. He sat very still while I talked, arms crossed, jaw tight. The same posture I remembered from childhood arguments over whose turn it was to help our father in the shop. For a moment I thought he might actually break, might finally tell me the truth without me having to drag it out of him piece by piece through lawyers and forensic accountants. Instead, he asked me, quietly, how long I'd had the earlier will before bringing it to a lawyer instead of to him first. Like the betrayal in this story was mine, going around him, rather than his, going around our father's actual wishes in the first place. I told him I'd gone to a lawyer because I no longer trusted that bringing anything to him directly would get me anywhere close to the truth, and something in his face told me he knew exactly why I felt that way. Derek's reaction told me almost everything I needed to know before he even said a word beyond that. He didn't ask to see the earlier will. He didn't ask how I'd found it. He got angry, fast, and defensive, in a way that felt less like innocent confusion and more like a man watching a story he'd built collapse faster than he could patch it. He told me I had no idea what those final months had actually been like, living in that house, managing our father's medications, his confusion, his bad days, while I visited for an hour twice a week and called it help. He wasn't entirely wrong about the weight of that burden, and some part of me still holds space for how hard those months must have genuinely been for him. But burden doesn't excuse fraud, and exhaustion doesn't explain a notary with an expired commission connected to your own in-laws. Then he said something that revealed far more than he probably intended to. He said that even if the will got thrown out, there wouldn't be much left to split anyway, because the business had taken on debt over the past year that none of us knew about. That single sentence opened up an entirely different problem. Renata brought in a forensic accountant, a colleague of hers named Priya Anand, to review Bennett Millworks' financial records for the previous 18 months. What Priya found over the following 3 weeks was that Derek had been quietly drawing loans against company assets, nearly $200,000 total, routed through accounts he controlled with minimal oversight once our father's health had declined enough that nobody else was checking the books closely. Some of it had gone toward legitimate equipment repairs. A significant portion had gone toward gambling debts tied to an online sports betting habit Derek had developed over the past 2 years, debts that had escalated sharply in the months before our father's death, right around the same time the second will had been drafted. Priya walked me through the pattern on a video call one evening, sharing her screen, showing me transfer after transfer, small enough individually to avoid drawing attention, but adding up over 18 months to a company slowly being hollowed out from the inside by someone everyone trusted to protect it. I remember staring at those numbers, recognizing the company's own accounting software I'd helped my father set up years earlier, and feeling something close to nausea, realizing how close all of this had come to disappearing entirely before anyone outside Derek's control ever thought to look. Derek needed the business, fully and solely, not because he believed he deserved it more than Sam or me, but because he needed sole control of the company's finances to keep covering losses he hadn't told anyone about, losses that would have been impossible to hide if ownership had stayed split 3 ways with an accountant sister looking closely at the books, which of course was exactly what I was. The picture that emerged was painful in a way I hadn't fully braced for. My brother hadn't manipulated our dying father out of simple greed. He'd done it out of desperation, panic, an addiction spiraling faster than his ability to control it, and a decision made somewhere in those final months. That protecting his own secret mattered more than honoring what our father actually wanted for all 3 of his children. Renata filed a formal will contest in probate court 6 weeks after I found that envelope, citing both lack of testamentary capacity, supported by my father's medical records, documenting significant cognitive decline during the relevant period, and undue influence, supported by the notarization, irregularities, and Derek's demonstrated financial motive. The case moved slower than I expected. Months of depositions, medical experts reviewing my father's records, Philip Ostrander testifying about the earlier will he'd properly executed, one of the longtime employee witnesses confirming under oath that she remembered signing a will years earlier that matched exactly what I'd found in that desk, not the version Halstead had read aloud. Sitting through those depositions was its own strange kind of grief. Hearing my father's decline described in clinical terms by doctors who'd examined records instead of the man himself, hearing dates and cognitive assessment scores stand in for what I remembered as him forgetting my name for a full, terrifying minute on a Tuesday afternoon before it came back to him, apologetic and shaken, both of us pretending afterward that it hadn't happened. Numbers and medical terminology can prove a case in a courtroom, but they can't hold the weight of what it actually felt like to watch someone you love disappear a little more each month, while everyone around you insisted he was fine. Derek's attorney tried to argue that the earlier will had simply been superseded by our father's later updated wishes, a normal and legal thing for any person to do. But the combination of the capacity evidence and the notarization fraud made that argument difficult to sustain. Deborah Prince herself, when finally deposed, admitted under pressure that she had never actually witnessed my father sign anything that Derek had asked her, as a favor to her brother's business associate, to sign as notary on a document already completed, and that she hadn't understood or hadn't let herself think too hard about what she was actually agreeing to. She cried during part of that deposition, according to Renata, saying she'd only meant to do a small favor for a family friend and had never imagined it would end up mattering this much. I believed her. I think most people who get pulled into something like this never imagine at the time how far the consequences will eventually reach. The judge issued a ruling 8 months after I found that envelope, invalidating the second will entirely due to both lack of proper execution and clear evidence of undue influence, and reinstating the earlier will as my father's valid final testament. Bennett millwork would be divided the way he'd always promised, equally between Derek and me, with Sam's trust fully funded exactly as our father had specified, protected in a structure that meant no single family member could ever again make decisions about Sam's care without oversight. The financial misconduct Priya uncovered led to a separate civil settlement. Derek agreeing to repay the company for the funds he'd drawn without authorization, structured over several years, in exchange for the family not pursuing criminal fraud charges related to the falsified notarization, a decision I fought hard for, honestly, more for Sam's sake than Derek's, because I didn't want our family's healing tied up in a courtroom for years longer than it already had been. I want to be honest about where things stand with Derek now, because this isn't the kind of story where everything gets wrapped up in a bow. We're not close. We speak when we have to, about the business, about Sam, civil but distant in a way that I think will probably define the rest of our relationship. I don't know if I've forgiven him yet, not fully. I understand intellectually the desperation that drove what he did. Understanding isn't the same thing as forgiveness, and I've stopped pretending to myself that it has to be. There was a moment near the end of the settlement negotiations when Derek asked to meet with me alone, no lawyers. Just the two of us at a diner outside town where nobody would recognize either of us. He apologized, and I believe the apology was genuine, at least in the moment he gave it. He told me he didn't fully understand how he'd let it go as far as it had, that it felt, looking back, like a series of small compromises that each seemed survivable on their own until they added up to something he barely recognized himself in. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, but I also told him that an apology, however sincere, doesn't undo what it cost Sam and me to have to fight for what our father already wanted us to have. He nodded, and we sat there for a while longer, not saying much, to people who used to build blanket forts together as kids, now negotiating the wreckage of what trust used to look like between us. What I hold on to instead is my father's letter, the 4 pages I found behind that false panel, written back when his hands were steady enough to write clearly and his mind was clear enough to see what might be coming. I think about how much courage it must have taken, a man watching his own memory start to fray, to sit down and try to protect the people he loved from a future he couldn't fully predict but was frightened enough of to prepare for anyway. That's not the kind of quiet strength that gets talked about much. Nobody throws a parade for a man who hides a will in a desk drawer because he's afraid of what he might not be able to stop later. But I think it might be one of the bravest things I've ever learned about my own father, and I only learned it because he trusted me to go looking in exactly the right place. Sam is doing well. The trust is funded, secure, overseen by people who answer to a court now instead of just to family goodwill, which I know sounds cold, but has actually given all of us a strange kind of peace, knowing his care can never again depend entirely on one person's decisions, good or bad. He still doesn't fully understand everything that happened, and honestly, I've chosen not to burden him with most of it. What he knows is that Dad made sure he'd always be taken care of, and that's true, and that's the part that matters most. I visit Sam every Sunday now, the way our father used to, and we've started a small tradition of our own, stopping by the shop on the way so he can sit in the office and listen to the saws running down the hall. Something he says makes him feel close to Dad in a way words never quite manage. He asked me once, a few months after everything settled, why Uncle Derek doesn't come around as much anymore. I told him things had gotten complicated between us, grown-up complicated, and that it wasn't anything he needed to worry about. He accepted that answer more easily than I expected, and I've wondered since whether some part of him understands more than he lets on, the way people sometimes do when they're paying closer attention than anyone gives them credit for. I run the millwork company now, alongside a general manager we hired to handle daily operations, and some mornings. Walking through that shop floor past the same table saw my father started with, I feel him there in a way I didn't expect grief to ever allow. I think he'd be proud of the outcome, not because Derek lost, that was never the point, but because the truth, once it finally had room to breathe, did exactly what he always believed it would do. It protected the people who couldn't fully protect themselves. So I'll ask you what I've been asking myself since I pulled that envelope out from behind a hidden panel in an old desk. If you found evidence that could destroy a family lie, but destroying it meant destroying your relationship with someone you loved in the process, would you still go looking for the truth? Or would some part of you rather leave that panel closed? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments below. And if this story reminded you of a truth your own family has had to face, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.